Okay. Wow, hello. Dan, it's been too long since we've cracked open this tome of easily discernible knowledge. We've been, as you say, distracted by anarchism for too long, and we're making our return finally to Karl Marx's Capital.
Yeah.
Wow, what a book.
You want to know what I think?
Let's hear it.
I think reading Capital's become too easy.
Oh, really?
Everybody's doing it.
Oh, sure, okay.
There's so many resources out there. So demystify it.
Yeah, sure.
Make it the simple and enjoyable experience it was always intended to be.
Sure, sure.
Who's going to restore the intellectual cachet of being the person who has read Capital?
I'll let you know when I see him.
Who is going to do the work of remystifying?
Remystifying.
Bringing forth the much needed obscurity.
Oh, I see.
Putting it,
Maybe I do see him.
putting it front and center.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tackle the remystifying. You tackle the recentering and bring it back onto the world stage. We're back. We're reading Capital. It's good to do this. Which section did we read? I just wrote down Capital 3, but obviously we're not on Volume 3 yet. We're barely past the 40-page mark of Capital Volume 1. Mm-hmm. We read Section 2 of Volume 1, Part 1, Chapter 1? Or Section 3? No, yeah, Section 3. Jesus, God.
Section 3, the form of value or exchange value.
Form of value or exchange value. Lot going on here. You know what, Dan? To start us off, as we've said before, Royal Listener, we are reading as kind of a guide from David Harvey's Companion to Reading Capital. And the section that Harvey has on Section 3 it starts out with a pretty great line, Dan. And may I read it, just for the listener?
Please.
He says, this section, and this is how he starts it, this section incorporates, in my view, a lot of boring material that can all too easily mask the significance of the argument being made. Marx sometimes puts on an accountant's hat, and the result is a form of exposition that can be tedious to the extreme. Tedious to the extreme, I think, is a little harsh. Especially for a guy writing a book about this book.
I'm sure there are greater heights of tedium to come.
Oh, absolutely, I'm sure. But yeah, this section had a lot of fluff, and as I was just saying to you, I think that when I read it the first time, I tried to read every single bit and understand every single bit to the best of my ability, and I was getting really frustrated with he brings back linen and he brings back the coat, and it's
our old friends,
coat and linen, and he really, as David Harvey says, puts on an accountant's hat, and it was a little. I think I should have just, my first time through, given it a more cursory read.
Yeah.
And gotten to the end to see the points that he was trying to make instead of how he was making them, if that makes sense.
I think that's the case for anything. Whenever you're reading anything that's particularly complicated or difficult, read it through and just absorb as much as you can, and then you can go back and start seeing it in its totality, as opposed to getting so bogged down in the moment that you're reading that you're like, I have to work out what the hidden mystery of this piece of terminology is. This phrase. What does he mean by this? Why is it is he just reiterating his point 5 times, or is there some great nuance that's being developed? Is the dialectic unfolding, and I'm just too stupid to work out what it is?
I'm part of a greater dialectic that I think only God can see, Dan. So that's what I'll say about that.
At least you know your place in the world.
I know my place. It is part of the dialectic. That's all I need to know. So what is he trying to do here? He's trying to do a couple of things, but he very casually says at the beginning, right, I'm going to, again, do something that nobody else has ever done, or at least done correctly, which is explain
Never
the
before has any man done anything, more things that no one else has done.
Yeah, I know. Pretty impressive.
I mean, if they'd had a Guinness Book of World Records.
yeah. Most time spent faffing about talking about linen. But yeah, no, he's trying to explain the money form and how that relates to exchange value and to value under capitalism, and and I think we'll get into this, kind of a bit of a historical argument as well there to how it relates to other modes, perhaps.
Yes, there's certainly the beginnings of a sort of truth to what is capitalism, what isn't capitalism. Yeah. It's difficult. This distinction between the sort of that Harvey brings up between the historical arguments made and the logical arguments made, and whether there is any quality in the historical arguments is sort of dubious and questionable. But how does that sort of the logic of the argument that's being made real things about history, or give us a way to look at history? Something it's food for thought, something to
Food for
ponder.
thought, indeed.
But yeah, you're quite right that he's trying to transition us from some of these elementary pieces of terminology that he's introduced us to, and sort of move toward or reveal or explain the emergence or explain the necessity to capitalism of the money form of value. And there are many mile markers along the road.
Oh my God.
Quite,
Oh my God.
quite a number of forms in which value can take.
You got your relative forms, you got your abstract forms, you got your double-decker forms. I mean, I think to
Dodecahedron.
yeah, exactly. I think just to kind of sum up what he's trying to do without getting into the weeds a lot, as we kind of have to do to explain this, though, because it would seem, I think, too cursory, is to just kind of say that he's making the point that in a developed market society, right, one commodity eventually replaces all others as a principle of exchange, which is that eventually right now is money, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, even since Marx's time, this has gone through a million different changes because it was gold, and then it was like gold standard paper-backed currency. Gold standard paper-backed currency. Paper gold-backed currency. It was paper-backed. Don't worry about it. And then, eventually in the 70s, everyone just kind of gave up on that and was like, fuck it, just free float everything. It's nothing. Don't worry about it. It's just money. But this is, again, where it gets into is this a historical argument or not? Because it's like, it is easy to see how if you're just trading in kind way back in the day, that Marx's point is that eventually one of those commodities, whether it be gold or coins or whatever, goes on to be like the standard bearer for kind of like representing in a material way value in a market, which is what we're left with under capitalism.
Yeah, although I think it would be fair to say that there are numerous other historical transitions and changes that have to happen, kind of thing.
Sure.
Which we know and sort of we've discussed before and come across the historical transitions from feudalism to capitalism. Not necessarily a additive natural process, but like a stark change in some respects. And
certainly.
Marx is here really what he's doing here is, in some respects, explaining the specificity of capitalism. Obviously, it's a book called Capital, and it's about what capitalism is, but it's definitely also about what capitalism is not. And there are numerous sections in this where he... There is definitely a point in this where the logical transition to a capitalist form of value, which is the substance of what is represented when commodities exchange. We do get to a point where there is a capitalist version of that comes along. It sort of emerges from the argument, which has to begin with a very simple type of exchange and then sort of develops into more complex and complicated forms. I kind of want to try and work out how it is that we've gotten to this point. Well, we've gotten to this point from the development of the argument so far, I suppose. I mean, there's a certain portion of this sort of like triad of pieces of terminology that this chapter is particularly focused on, and it's particularly focused on the sort of like emergent quality of exchange value and how it is related to and comes out of these other two pieces of terminology, use value and value.
Sure.
So sort of coming back to David Harvey's depiction of the sort of like dialectical triangle to some extent. Like he's talking about exchange value, but he's talking about how exchange value is the nature of exchange value comes out of this sort of like relationship between these other two terms. And so many of these qualities are emergent from a relationship. There are so many bits of sort of Marx's analysis where he's like, well, I mean, like with a commodity, for example, you can't, what he says, you can't have a single commodity and look at it and say, read into it what its value is. But at the same time, under capitalism, we do know that all things that trade as commodities have this thing as called value. We know that they have some kind of objective quality. And to have a capitalist economy, you have to have that idea in place, right? I mean, we were discussing this beforehand. Like, under feudalism, say, or under another historical mode of production, sort of trades may well have happened between people. They may have bartered and exchanged between two products that they had, but mostly that was predicated on need, which is an extension of use value, right? Like, these are the useful qualities of these things, and one person needs those useful qualities that somebody else has, and so they swap them, kind of thing. But in that relationship, there is no acknowledgement of there being something in those qualities, in those commodities, which is universally recognizable as a objective type of value, I suppose. So one of the steps that happens along the way in this quite sort of like tedious and long drawn out exposition of all these different stages of the development from a very simple mode of exchange to sort of like, what does he call them? Forms of value, right? Like an elementary form of value, and the development toward the sort of total form of value that is, in essence, the money form of value. One of the things that happens is this sort of like this question of how do we come to recognize something qualitatively the same about commodities which are in their sort of physical form entirely qualitatively different.
Yeah, and I will say that was something that kind of like bought this like what we've read so far kind of a little bit like made me a little bit more comfortable with it all, because like when he's discussing value kind of like in the earlier sections, it seems very like something that you're not used to when you read Marx or when you discuss Marx, which is something that's, he keeps saying that value has this like phantom-like quality that isn't material at all. And if you come to this thinking like, oh, Marx is just going to give me like a complete like materialist explanation for capitalism and for everything like that, that's pretty off-putting. And it was very off-putting for me. I was like, whoa, buddy, where are you going with that? But he makes the point that with like the rise of the money form, and I suppose he's saying that this was necessary to have capitalism, but he's saying that with the rise of the money form, value, like the money form like allows for value to become the regulator of exchange relations, and it allows for like this material like thing where you can like kind of like, obviously it's not a 1-to-1 ratio at all in terms of like monetary like value versus like capital V value, what's inside of like inherent in a commodity, but it does allow for like a material basis to build on top of to determine like a monetary price. So it kind of like brings materialism back into it, as like I think capitalism obviously like requires, right?
Sure.
Because you can't just like say we're just going to trade, based upon value, without having like a material basis to do that, right?
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting relationship. And again, we were talking about like, I don't know, I'm still a little confused on like if this was like chicken or the egg, like how this relationship developed over time between like value and a money form. But yeah, it's just interesting and like I think refreshing to bring like materialism back into this a little bit.
Yeah.
And not just have everything be like this phantom-like quality that like, don't worry about it, it exists.
Yeah, Harvey makes that point, doesn't he? He's like, wait a minute, isn't Marx meant to be a materialist? And so many of his arguments hinge on these things which have no physical like material form kind of thing. But that's the sort of the nature of Marx's materialism, that social relations are material things. The value form, which is the essence of capitalism, is a material quality kind of thing.
Really, exactly. And I mean, I'm still kind of confused. I know that I suppose, yes, it is possible to determine the socially necessary labor time that goes into creating a product, right? A commodity. But again, like that's also kind of hard to marry with this idea that it is like, first of all, that's extremely complicated to do and it's always changing as productive forces get developed. But it's also kind of hard just to marry with this idea of like the phantom-like quality of value, but then also assigning it like this material basis. It's like, yeah, it's still cogitating, composting in my brain. Everything in this is like a relationship within a relationship that is a relationship in and of itself. And it's just like, oh my God, the dialectic is unfolding before my eyes.
Yeah.
As I was just saying to you, Dan, what I got from all this is that we need to bring the gold standard back.
Yeah. There is certainly work being done and has been done in extrapolating from this book a sort of Marxist concept of money, and the question of whether Marx can furnish us with information necessary to sort of understand and interpret how money functions in the contemporary world. Because, I mean, at least in this chapter, the logical argument doesn't extend so far as a money form which is abstracted totally from some relationship to some physical commodity.
I mean, he is still basically just talking about gold.
Yeah,
And it's like,
yeah. And he's very sort of simple and flippant in the idea that like as soon as gold comes to function as the total form of value, you have money.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that. But there's quite a lot in this where like every transition isn't really a transition. It's just a sort of logical. It sort of lends weight to the idea of a logical argument, right? It's like, actually, I got to the point where logically the next thing extends from the previous thing. And like,
I mean, just one more thing to say about like the relationship between the like immaterial value and the like materialismness of the money form. I just think it's really interesting how Marx makes the point that you really need to understand that socially necessary labor time and like value can only really regulate itself and value and like the money form indirectly. It can only regulate socially necessary labor time can only regulate value through the money form, right? So that like under capitalism, like one needs the other to operate. It's I don't know. That's just another really interesting point of like, since value is basically like just like a social relation. And again, like I was saying, the phrase that really made me understand this was like value is immaterial but objective. Like it needs the money form to regulate, I guess, in capitalism. And it does so indirectly through the money form. But again, like it's not this one-to-one relationship, value to money to price, right? It's, I mean, again, I got to the end of this and I was like, okay, I see what you're saying, but like there's like a million other things that go into determining the price form and through money. So it's like, looking forward to see how that gets developed.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of the essential or the necessity to develop a money form of value stems, I suppose, from the sort of like incomplete nature of some of these other forms of value that he's describing. So you have the elementary form of value, which is just the relationship between one commodity and another. Like one commodity exchanges for a certain quantity of another. And then you have sort of like the expanded version of that, which is that, well, that one commodity in exchanging for one other commodity, it would be possible to say, well, that one commodity also exchanges in a similar way for the entire sort of like breadth and world of commodities. But for Marx, there are certain flaws even with that kind of relationship. And what you really need to be able to have a world of commodities whereby it, as we were saying before, like that essential quality of capitalism is fulfilled, that all commodities are seen to bear some qualitative resemblance. They have some kind of quality which is common to all of them. That thing that we've talked about before, that they're the product of abstract human labor. Yeah. What does he say, that they're the sort of like depositories? They're labor in its congealed form.
Yeah. He makes another metaphor with germs that I kind of found a little disgusting as well. But
it's jam packed full of metaphors. Some of them more useful than others.
Yes.
But yeah, it's only with the development of one commodity which steps apart from all other commodities that you're able to then have this web of interconnecting commodities that all share the same quality, which is labor, which is the essence of capitalism kind of thing. You cannot have a sort of totalizing capitalist market, and you can't have this thing which we were saying earlier, which Marx it sort of suggests is intuitive to us all, that like we live under capitalism, we just assume that everything has a value that's unique to that thing, but which is determined by how it relates to all other things in the world.
Yeah.
And you can only get to the point where you have this sort of like relationship between all commodities if you have developed this idea. Well, you can only explain how we now live in this world if you go through these logical phases of getting us to the point where you have this idea that everything can have a sort of like
measurable,
a total, a value which is represented by its worth in money. Its price, the price form, another form,
another goddamn form. I have a question. We haven't talked about this yet, but I was wondering in reading this, did you get the sense that Marx was making the point that under like primitive or earlier forms of market exchange relations, that a universal equivalent, like a commodity universal equivalent, something like that, is inevitable? Is that kind of the point that he was making, or is he just making the point that, like, certainly didn't seem like he was making the point that it was a fluke that something like that happened? You know what I mean? So is he making like a point that this was just bound to happen if we have relations along the lines of like trade and something like that, that one commodity is going to show up and become the universal equivalent?
I suppose in answering that, I would think back to history, I suppose, or go back to considering the transition to capitalism, which I guess we've determined or decided.
We've decided it. We've figured it out.
We know, which we know resulted when human labor became disciplined to the market, or rather, people's day-to-day productive activities were all done with the sort of like disciplining eye of the market. The requirement to compete with others creates this world in which it is possible to compare through the market the productive capacities of various different types of human labor. And not only that, but it's necessary for an economic system to exist which is dependent on the imperative to improve one's efficiencies to create more value, to be able to have this process of comparison of people's labor to other people's labor in the market, and therefore, as an extension of that, you also have to be able to compare the amount of labor. The process by which that happens is through this process of attributing to all commodities a certain value, which is determined by how much labor has actually gone into making them, kind of thing. So I suppose, like, if you want to, I mean, talk about it in terms of like somebody setting out a plan for how to actually have this economy.
God.
But if through historically contingent circumstances you have found yourselves in the position of attempting to operate the kind of economy that I've just described, the requirement to have a universal equivalent, a material base for that practice becomes necessary, kind of thing. So I suppose what I'm saying here, what my answer is that, like, the requirement to have that thing, that universal equivalent, is emergent from the transition into capitalism, I suppose.
Yeah.
So then the question is, like, if I recall what your question was correctly, the question is, like, how necessary is that in other modes of production?
Sure, because I think
like, imagine feudalism or some other mode of production where everybody is laboring for themselves.
Sure.
Any exchange is just sort of a supplement to that form of labor, right?
Sure. Except for like longer, like trade, like longer distance trade or even just trade. Because when I kind of think about like gold in the Roman Empire or gold in like an ancient mode, or even up until like, like Venice in some kind of like ancient mode, like proto-capitalist. I might get heat for saying that, but like I think of like gold coins and stuff like that as appearing, and this might not be true, but appearing because it's like people would have just been trading in terms of like use values. I need this thing, you need that thing, blah, blah, blah. But then you go to someone and it's like, okay, I really want that, but I don't have anything that you want to trade me for. So there's just kind of like this development of like a proto universal form of a commodity, which is just like gold coins, because it's like, okay, just take these coins and exchange it for what you actually want. You know what I mean? So it's like, is that actually like an earlier form of the universal like equivalent? You know what I mean? Or is it like you're definitely right about like the necessity of something like that. It would certainly seem inevitable under capitalism to have like a money form. But like something like gold coins, is that a universal equivalent? You know what I mean? Because it certainly seems like that was definitely at least the beginning of something like a universal form, like one commodity setting itself apart, right? Maybe not, I shouldn't say commodity, but like one product. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, we've already come across the idea that like markets can exist in two different modes of production, but take totally different forms and fulfill different functions. Like, surely the same is true of money.
Yeah.
And like the transitions to capitalism didn't like it invented certain new concepts and ideas, but really what it did was just sort of took the old as it existed and only modified them to the degree that it needed to.
Yeah.
My guess would be that in the scenario you just described, money was being used to augment an exchange of use values.
Yeah.
No, like
sure.
it's only like expanding over distance or over time. The exchange in uses.
That makes sense. Yeah. Then I wonder. I think that's what my question is. First of all, is that like the proto-development of a universal form? And then like, if it is, then was that inevitable under like not non-capitalist yet modes of production or just trade, I suppose? Yeah. Was it, I don't know. I don't really ever want to use the word inevitable, but it certainly seemed like it. It certainly seemed like there's one commodity that everybody can agree, like, okay, I'm a Phoenician. I need more wood. Okay, you're over here. You have wood, but like, there's nothing really else that I can give you. Yeah. So let's just agree that like this shiny thing will work. I guess, I don't know.
Yeah, but I suppose the question is then like there is a universal equivalent as we're taught as the language worth using, but what does that equivalent stand in for?
Yeah, exactly, right. Exactly.
I mean, it's just an abstract definition to say that money is a universal equivalent but a universal equivalent for something.
True. Yeah.
But that something is different and determined by the nature of the mode of production under which it's functioning, I suppose.
And under capitalism, and this will transition us very nicely into the next bit. I just really quickly want to talk about the bit about Aristotle, where he says that, what was the quote? He said something like, for trade to happen, you need equality, but for equality or something like that, you need commensurability. And Marx just basically says that that's where Aristotle stops about like, because Aristotle, I suppose, basically just says, give up on trying to figure out what's commensurable and not. Give up on trying to figure out what is measurable or not in terms of labor or in terms of production or anything like that. And Marx is like, well, of course he would say that. He lived in a society with slaves that was based upon like the natural inequality of some people. I don't know if I really had a point in bringing that up, other than that it was just a very funny point.
It's a useful case for elaborating this distinction, right? Like, or elucidating the argument, I suppose. Like, for things which are ostensibly different to appear as the same, you have to find some quality in them that's unique to all of them. And Aristotle was asking himself the same question. But it's only Marx and not Aristotle that's able to say that labor is the universal equivalent. No, it's the thing that's common to all of these commodities, because Aristotle, living in a slave mode of production, couldn't possibly say that all labor was equivalent.
Yeah, that's brutal. That's so brutal.
But no, it's a
valid point. It's a good point.
It's a fun thing, but maybe you're right. Maybe Marx just wanted to like
sit on his brain and ridicule simpletons like Aristotle.
Ridicule Aristotle.
That's all we want to do. It's just
Oh,
ridicule
to be
Aristotle.
able to ridicule Aristotle one day. Thought I might read that quote about the specificity of the mode of production, of the capitalist mode of production, just because it's nice to highlight these things when they come along. What Marx is telling us is about that is unique to capitalism, kind of thing. So he says, every product of labour is, at all stages of society, a use value. But it is only at a definite historical epoch in a society's development that such a product becomes a commodity, viz., at the epoch when the labour spent on the production of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of the article, i.e., as its value. So yeah, I mean that's just to explain a lot of the things that we've said so far. Or that's just to be evidence for the things that we've been saying so far. Like we are attempting to compare to commodities, and the unique aspect of the capitalist mode of production is that it has cast as a material quality of all commodities that they are the product of undifferentiated human labor.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Which I suppose there is a certain amount of commensurability of that under capitalism, which is, I think, another large point here. Yeah. Was there anything else that we wanted to bring up? I did, really quickly, I would like to just say that last paragraph of the Harvey, where he was discussing this about the spatio-temporal relationships of all the different types of value under capitalism was really, really interesting about, I would just say, honestly, I'm not going to do it justice. So dear listener, if you're interested in that, just go look it up. But it is interesting seeing how space and time relate to use value, to exchange value, and to value. I thought that was quite good. So kudos, Harvey.
Yeah. So a final thought from me, a little bit of a monologue, perhaps.
Let's hear it.
So we've talked about this. The first form in which this relationship appears is the elementary form. It's the simple exchange between two commodities. You have one commodity that Marx defines as the relative, and one that Marx defines as the equivalent. And Marx puts a lot of stock, and most of his analysis is interested in this function of the equivalent, mostly because as the argument develops, it is this equivalent which actually develops into the money form, right? You have a commodity and you're trying to decide work out what its value is, and it's only in relation to some other commodity you can reveal what its value is, and it's only in relationship to the equivalent that you can determine what the value of the relative commodity is.
Sure.
Okay. And these two forms are fulfilling different functions, right? And I spent a long time trying to struggle through what are the various functions that these things fulfill.
Dan, I saw Dan's wall recently, and Dan does indeed have a cork board and red string going on.
Pretty
So
crazy.
that's all I'm going to say.
It's on the back of my eyes all the time. But really all I wanted to say was something that I decided I'd sort of settled on as being one outcome of all of my corkboard and red stringery. I sort of settled on the idea that something very peculiar is happening in this expanded form, and I think it's something which explains quite a lot of the things that we have so far encountered in Capital. So I'll just rattle through these very quickly. There are three sort of peculiarities, as Marx describes them, or in this translation, Marx describes them, to the equivalent form. One is that it's the equivalent form that mediates this relationship between use value and value, and allows for the use value of one commodity to become measured by another and therefore emerge as value in the abstract. So one of the things it's doing is mediating this peculiar relationship between use value and value. And as an extension of that, the other peculiarity is that in this process, in this relationship process, concrete labor becomes abstract. So it's a way for you to take the concrete labor of one commodity and sort of transpose it into abstract labor kind of thing.
Dematerialize
You
it. As a good old Marxist would.
Yeah, dematerialize it.
Only to rematerialize
into the
it.
pattern buffer.
Jesus.
Hopefully, some savvy transporter chief will work out how to rematerialize it in the future. And also, the third thing that happens as an extension from the first two is that the private labor of an individual person, which is the concrete labor, which also creates the use value, becomes transposed or transmuted into social labor, something which is like socially recognized, I suppose. It becomes it takes on some kind of like social substance that is separate from the labor that's gone into making an individual commodity, and makes it something which can be compared to all of the commodities. So I just wanted to run through those three things because like it's in this process of the transition from a very simple type of exchange to the sort of like fully developed capitalist money economy that some of these sort of dialectical relationships are resulting. Some of the syntheses that we've described are now being like explained in this chapter.
Absolutely. And I will say too, very, very well said. If anything that perhaps I have said in this, or if you're just one of those commies that like reads this and is like, bro, just money isn't real. Who gives a fuck? I would say that is not the, I think, correct take on this section, because I think what Marx is saying is that, okay, money is kind of like, it's kind of like not the best thing in the world, but it also has like this very clear social element to it, and the relations that you experience because of the money form are indeed very real. So don't ever forget that, kids.
Yeah, it's not made up, and don't like listen to some of these bong grip takes that you get from people who like money, man. It's just like
money, bro.
I mean, yeah, it is a social relationship, but it's an incredibly important and material one.
Of course,
and it does need to be overturned, but it's not just a matter of like thinking it,
ripping the form away, as we will call it, bong ripping the form away.
And it further to that point, like sometimes you'll hear people casting money as the embodiment of the sort of the evil root of our society. And it's not the money.
Yeah,
you have to look a bit deeper.
It's not the money, folks.
It's the social relations of capitalism itself, of which the money is just an emergent quality.
If there are any communists out there who think that, though, feel free to donate your money, honestly. Just get rid of it. It's not good. Money is still bad, folks. And just
give it to someone's patron.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Communism. It's sounding better every day, I'll be honest. The more I read about this capitalism thing, it's sounding better every day. So we'll be back next time.
if only in that the book Communism will hopefully be quite a lot shorter and quite a lot less wordy. And
a lot easier to understand. We'll be back, dear listener, probably to just finish out chapter 1 next time, I would imagine, which is section 4, where we're getting into
very excitable,
very exciting fetishism of commodities, which sounds sexy. All right, so we'll be back with that. And yes, in the meantime, Dan and I will be struggling with those 7 pages. So hope you enjoyed that. If anybody has any takes they'd like to share with us, share away, either on Instagram, Twitter, or where a lot of corrections have been being made by one very faithful listener, YouTube.
In the YouTube comments.
In the YouTube comments.
Like, share, and subscribe.
yeah, please, rate 5 stars. All right, we'll see everybody next time. The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.